Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm, and I'll be your host. So today we have a special guest. Our special guest today is Doomberg. How you doing today, Doomberg?
Hey, doing all right, Kirk? How are you?
Doing great, doing great. Well, this is a special treat for me. I'm trying to get Doomberg on for a while, and for those of you who don't know Doomberg, you should come watch the video. I got a nice green chicken on the screen that I'm interviewing today. So, Doomberg, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background for listeners who aren't familiar with you.
You bet. So first of all, it's great to be here. Looking forward to a fantastic conversation. Glad we were able to find the time and get this done. Yeah, I'm the head writer for the Doomberg Substack. We write about energy, finance, the economy at large. We're a small team of former industry executives slash consultants who started a blog 3 years ago under the hypothesis that the industry voice was missing from the energy debate. I'm personally a trained scientist and spent a couple of decades leading research teams around the world, working on next generation energy type technologies, commodity technologies. And so far too often, people who have industrial expertise are um, trapped behind public affairs teams who are afraid to sort of say the wrong thing in public. We, of course, have no such constraints. And so when we looked at the sort of blog, newsletter, energy finance space, there were sort of three categories of people who had only ever worked on Wall Street, which is great, people who had only ever worked in universities, or people who had only ever worked in government. And I think we bring a unique mix. We have a pretty strong finance background on our team, venture capital, private equity, financial analysis, in addition to the science core, and then the industrial lens to the challenge of energy and policymakers and so on. And so I think we caught lightning in a bottle. It's been an amazing ride. We're the number one paid finance Substack in the world, which is amazing and humbling and unbelievable to say. Still pinch myself every time we're privileged enough to say that we currently occupy that spot. I'm sure it won't be permanent, but yeah, this is let's just say I found what I was personally meant to be doing in life. And if you're ever lucky enough to stumble upon such a thing, just keep doing it.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, congratulations on your success. I know it's well deserved for the quality work you put out. So kudos.
Thank you.
I have to ask because I know the listeners are going to be sitting there staring at the screen wondering. So what's with the green chicken? Like why the anonymity?
We had started Doomberg from scratch, coming up on 3 years ago. Our first piece was May 3rd, 2021, as I recall. And we originally wrote under the moniker of Doomberg and the Green Chicken for sort of a growth hack exercise. If we were just another uh, person in a tie, it'd be much more difficult to be remembered on Twitter, for example, which is where we grew early on, where we grew most of our audience. And one of our philosophies in the marketing category, which I think we have a pretty strong skill set in marketing and branding, is that you can't be remembered if you don't stand out. And so the green chicken was kind of funny. It's got those stunned eyes. We came to prominence during an energy crisis. And so we chronicled that energy crisis a fair bit, and we were puzzled by a lot of the decisions that we were seeing being made. And it just stuck, and then we blew up. So I mean, let's be honest. We've grown this thing by an order of magnitude greater than what our wildest dreams would have been. And so once you catch lightning in a bottle, then you have a different problem. So we growth, we hacked growth through the green chicken. We have observed on FinTwit and in other sort of social media circles that when a large social media property, which is anonymous, de-anonymizes, they tend to pull the plug on a fair bit of the brand intrigue. And having created something so valuable, so fun, we've just decided that we're never going to do that. We're just going to keep it anonymous, even though hundreds of people know who we are. We've met Substack's leadership in person. Our Stripe knows who we are. We passed their KYC, AML, and we couldn't have gone paid without linking our bank accounts. And our bankers know that we're doing Doomberg, and our friends and family and former coworkers know we're doing Doomberg. It's not some big secret. I mean, we're not writing these things from jail. It's just a matter of having created a brand. What do you have to do to protect it? And we feel like this is probably the best way to protect it.
Nice. Well, I imagine if you're talking about the energy industry, probably anonymity doesn't hurt, right?
If there is a side benefit of people generally have to tackle your opinions as opposed to trying to destroy you personally. Um, we generally color within the lines, and so I don't view that as a huge risk. But at the same time, it is nice to have honest and open discourse based on ideas and arguments and debates. And I do think that the online experience is moving towards this direction. People can create characters online. My children are online for most of their lives. Their friends are online. The vast majority of people that I would consider my quote friends today, I've not yet met in person. The old Twitter DMs and Slack rooms and various other ways that you communicate with people, Zoom meetings. And so there's, of course, a cost to that. There's the in-person experience still has some uniqueness to it. But at the same time, I personally and other members of the team have been able to meet a whole wide array of interesting experts and other people online that you would have never met in the old days, absent these tools. There's risks, of course. There's all manner of creeps online and people with issues that you wouldn't invite into your life necessarily. But overall, on balance, if you handle it correctly, I think it is net positive.
Yeah. No, you mentioned one important thing in that they have to, when you're anonymous, they have to tackle your ideas and not you. I just remember I think it was like 2 days ago, I rewatched the movie V for Vendetta, and one of the final lines was, why won't you die? And he's like, because ideas are bulletproof. You know?
Well, and look, I do think that it is one of the challenges with modern society is that the politics of personal destruction has become so effective. If you just look at the American electoral campaigns, and I mean, it long ago ceased being about ideas and competence, for example. Like, well, generally speaking, a person who is quick on their feet and a good debater is a pretty good leading indicator of competence. Now, that doesn't mean that people who can't debate aren't competent in their own way, but as a general rule, there's a reason why we held presidential debates. Like, there's a reason why you should listen to your politicians articulate and defend their ideas. And if they can't articulate them or defend them, as I suspect the current president perhaps might struggle to do, then that gives you input into your voting decision as a member of our democracy. Now, these are all quaint ideas that I've long ago been brushed aside, but I do think, like if you take, we had kicked up a little bit of a hornet's nest with some cheap oil work that we had published, and we had a very nice debate with Adam Rosenzweig of GNR, and Adam Taggart hosted it, and like we got so much positive feedback just for the nature of the conversation, which is great, except it's really an indication of how rare that is in today's society, which is sad, actually. I grew up watching the old Oxford debates, and I debated a bit in high school, and by the way, back in the day, you would be given both sides of the same question, and you would be forced to like think creatively about how to articulate your case. Like that, there's not enough of that in our society today, and so in our own minuscule way, we try to live by that mantra and be open to things and admit when we're wrong and always try to be learning and stay humble. And so it's been great.
Yeah, it's funny. I think about 6 months ago we had Lee Gehring on the show, talking about commodities, and it was a great interview. But let me ask you this, because I mean you're really one of the foremost, if not the foremost, energy expert out there in the public space. So what would you say are some of the biggest challenges that we face right now, just to kind of start off the conversation?
So the first challenge that we face actually as analysts is making sure that we don't slip into the role of advocate. So if you make a prediction on something or you create a brand around something and it doesn't go your way, you have to react to the facts. And so for us, we've always said that the first question one must answer when analyzing an economy is whether that economy is long or short primary energy. And the mere asking of that question implies there's two possible states. And as I referred to earlier, we came up through the newsletter business during an energy crisis. And there's no question that the energy crisis made our unique takes on the situation valuable and was certainly an input into our growth, but the world has changed. And we made a call in the latter part of 2023 that the world, in fact, had flipped from being short energy to being long energy. And we put out that call, much to the chagrin of some of our subscribers, because some people are looking for confirmations of their biases as opposed to sort of an authentic pursuit of the truth. And we came about this call by studying the natural gas market and seeing this glut coming, and it has since materialized. And proud of the work that we did on that subject, and having the courage is the wrong word because we write a blog. How could you be courageous writing a blog? But putting that call out there when we did given how we came up through the ranks, I think was important to do for our credibility. So your question, like, what are our big concerns? I think when you're long energy, you don't have that much in the way of concerns. If we look around the world today, oil is the only one I guess we could talk about, but coal is cheap. Natural gas is dirt cheap. It's really dirt cheap in the US. Coal at $80 a barrel is beginning to push towards the higher end of the range that we've been stuck in since Biden emptied the SPR. And if we see an escalation in the Middle East, that could change things. So I think the one thing that is still a worry for us on the screen is, the whole Red Sea Houthis war with Israel, the ever-growing tensions between Biden and Netanyahu, the U.S.'s ever precarious situation in the United Nations, which is not being reported on here in the West, and whether or not the BRICS countries force a vote on at the General Assembly. The U.S. is burning a lot of credibility with its stance in the Middle East right now. So if a hot war breaks out between the U.S. and Iran, all bets are off. I think you could see oil go to $100 or $120 or $140 a barrel. Of course, if that happens, it tends to be negative for the economy, at least, especially for those who are short energy. So that's on the board as something to worry about. But overall, absent a black swan event like that, I think energy markets are pretty well balanced. And the crisis of 21, 22 is over. And we're in a period, an extended period, really, of excess energy on a global scale.
Interesting. So, I've been reading and hearing from other people that a lot of the dynamics are actually suggest that withstanding the Middle East conflict, obviously, which we can't predict, but withstanding that, from what I've been hearing from a lot of people is that there's a underdevelopment, or maybe not undersupply, but the factors leading towards higher energy prices because during the Biden administration, they're certainly not into exploring for more oil, and they're not really, well, publicly, they're not supportive of it. So why? So you're saying it's pretty well balanced. So can you kind of get a little more into the deep
Sure.
into the weeds there?
Yeah. So what Biden says and what has happened in the U.S. are diametrically opposed. And it's interesting. Biden is an interesting character, and he has people around him who understand commodities. One of the things that changed our minds on this was when we did this deep dive on natural gas, and we saw the glut of light sweet crude, natural gas liquids, and natural gas forming in the U.S. Look, since the shale revolution, which is only a decade and a half old, the U.S. has added 2.5 Saudi Arabias of exajoules to its energy mix. And unlike most petrostates, the U.S. has integrated downstream manufacturing to feed that energy abundance into. So we wrote a piece called Slick Landing, where we predicted that there probably won't be a recession before the election because Biden is running huge deficits and the country is swimming in dirt cheap hydrocarbons. And that's not a recipe for a recession. Now, you might want one. You might hope Trump wins. You might hate Biden. That's all fine, but that's not reality. Like the U.S. produces 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products a day, which is 20% of global oil supply. We produce more than a quarter of the world's natural gas, most of which is trapped here. As we're talking today, natural gas is trading for $1.80 per million BTUs, which is the equivalent of $10 a barrel oil. We are producing so much natural gas, and so many downstream industrial factories and brownfield sites use natural gas. Homes are heated with natural gas, that it is an amazing tailwind for economic growth in the U.S. Here's the part that I find difficult to understand. Everybody knows that if oil spikes, recessions follow. Everybody knows that Germany screwed up its energy policy and now it's deindustrializing. Well, what happens if you have an abundance? Like under President Biden, the U.S. has set records for oil production, smashed records for natural gas production, smashed records for NGL production, and also set records for refinery runs. We have more refining capacity than we need, and we export refined products at a pretty significant scale. We are the world's only energy gigapower. And on top of that, we have downstream manufacturing, amazing universities, all of the strategic geopolitical advantages that Peter Zeihan likes to talk about. We have a lot going for us here. Now, look, our politics are a mess. DC is corrupt. We're running unsustainable fiscal deficits. I don't think our 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 politics and our fiscal situation are sustainable. All those things are true. They're risks. They're real. They're there. They're not going to materialize before the election. And so for those that were wondering, hoping, or predicting a recession in late 2023, 2024, by the way, we were among them. We got that wrong. And when you get something wrong in life, the first thing you have to understand is why. There's two ways to approach being wrong on a call. One is the data's wrong. The data is being fabricated. And that happens. But that's not the base case. The base case is you missed something. Go back and find out what it was. What we missed was we thought US energy production would roll over. It didn't. It just didn't. The technological horsepower in the US energy sector, by the way, for which Biden gets no credit. He just gets the benefit. The president, home field advantage, incumbency matters. He gets the benefit of it, but he doesn't deserve credit for it. And there's a distinction between the two. So if you are producing a glut of cheap hydrocarbons and you have the manufacturing downstream supply chains to plug that advantage into, you're not going to go into a recession. I'm sorry, you're just not. And if that's something you were hoping for, or politically you wouldn't mind seeing, or you had bet on the stock market accordingly, it just didn't work. And that's fine. Like, not all your calls are going to work. Not all our calls are going to work. But on this one, I can explain it at least. U.S. set records when we thought it would roll over. And the economy did stronger than we did. All we did was connect those two things.
Yeah, I appreciate your transparency on that, because I think the financial industry is great at making predictions that tend to be wrong, and then no one bothers to admit that they're wrong or why. And as you mentioned, frequently when people are wrong, they blame it on bad data. Oh, the CPI is corrupt. It's government. It's making numbers up. Well, okay, so what, right? I know that interest rates, for example, the market has been drastically wrong on interest rates pretty much for the last 2 years. I think as soon as Powell started raising rates, they were like, 6 months it'll be lower. This is after the first one. No one's believed Powell for like the last 2 years, and it's been shocking. They still don't believe him, even though he's saying like, "Hey, we're going to keep it here," and they're like, "Yeah, you're still going to drop rates quite a bit." I don't
That's amazing,
understand
by the
that.
way. By the way, we're talking about some of the most sophisticated investors in the world, the Fed
Yes.
watchers, right? I mean, these are very intelligent people who have way more money on the line than you and I do, for getting those calls right. And as you have said, they have gotten them consistently wrong. And in fact, that was one of the motivating factors for us to do the deep dive we did and to change our view on energy. Because again, if you had said to me, we're going to take rates from 0 to 5 in the blink of an eye, I would have said we're going to break something. We didn't. Okay, what happened? Why? Like, it's clear we have a pretty good economy, especially when you consider we took rates from 0 to 5 in the blink of an eye. What's different? Well, what's different this time, on the positive side, is we have this enormous energy abundance, and we have a very strong belief that energy is the single most important thing you have to understand, and it's the single least appreciated thing about an economy. On the other side, of course, we've never raised rates at this pace with this much debt, which is what Luke Gorman would argue, and we agree with him, and it's been interesting to see. But and yes, interest rates have caused the national interest expense to exceed $1 trillion, I'm told. Well, there's an argument that is in fact bullish for economic growth, because that money is going to investors. It's a form of fiscal stimulus. I don't think it's sustainable, but in the short period, people who are earning extra interest on their money tend to spend it, and it might not have the velocity of stimmy checks, but it's still stimulating to the economy. And so that's an interesting observation. Look, every single economic situation is unique. As analysts, you only have historical models to try and guess as to what will happen, educated guesses as to what will happen. And when those models don't work, you have to ask yourself what was different this time. And I think the thing that was drastically different this time is we added 2.5 Saudi Arabias. Like, I've been to Saudi Arabia. It's a very rich country. 2.5 of those plugged into the US is going to make a lot of people rich. And it has.
So let me ask you this, because there's some rather large trends obviously going on in the energy space. One of them is clean energy, which obviously contradicts the direction of carbon-based energy. So Where do you see that going, and how is that affecting energy prices and the energy sector as a whole?
We developed what we call Doomberg's postulate, which states the following. Every gram of fossil fuels produced worldwide will be burned by somebody somewhere, and local restrictions in that regard merely shift who enjoys the privilege of doing so. And if you look at global primary energy consumption since the 60s, the amount of fossil fuels we have consumed goes up in a straight line. And we have no reason to believe that some countries arbitrarily deciding to disarm themselves is somehow going to lead net integrated across the world to less fossil fuels consumption. Energy is life. The amount of energy you get to harness defines your standard of living. All humans everywhere want a higher standard of living. If we don't burn coal here, they're going to burn it in Indonesia, South Africa, China, and India, and they are. If we don't burn oil here, they're going to burn it in all those other countries. The global south exists on a fraction of the energy that we are privileged enough to exist on here in the US. And if we stop consuming, they'll pick it up. They just will. And so the thing that will constrain or gate the amount of fossil fuels we consume is the amount of fossil fuels we produce, which is what makes European energy strategy so silly, for example, because they produce none. Like the European Union, which excludes, of course, the UK and Norway, produces almost no oil or natural gas. Some countries of the EU produce coal for their own consumption, like Germany and Poland. But by and large, the EU produces nothing in the way of fossil fuels. So how little fossil fuels they use is irrelevant to the global consumption, because every gram of fossil fuels produced will be burned by somebody somewhere. And China is building coal plants at a historic rate. They will swamp the number of coal plants coming offline in the West. Now, I should say, we put out a piece after COP28 where we articulated what we believe to be the grand bargain coming out of that meeting, which is the West will stop burning coal and leave coal to the global South. In the West, we will replace coal with natural gas. We will consider carbon capture and sequestration and nuclear power as green. And then the West will continue to tinker around with wind and solar and electric vehicles, pretending as though it makes a difference. That is kind of the readout from COP28. And if you look at the fact that in 2023, we smashed global coal consumption records, we're going to do so again in 2024. We'll all keep pretending like by some distant year in the future, all this is going to change. It's not going to change. We are going to roll the dice on climate change, and we will handle the consequences, the negative ones, as they arise.
Well, as is politics in general, right? Wait till the next crisis and then we'll handle it.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you're asking people to do is to voluntarily lower their standards of living. And that is just a losing political ticket. Just
Yeah.
is. Look what's happening in Germany. Look what Biden did. At the moment, oil jumped up to 125. Empty the SPR. Biden knows how the price of gasoline impacts his political future. And in hindsight, it was a shrewd move. It worked. The midterms did better. Democrats did better in the midterms than many had anticipated. And he's doing the same thing now with the LNG export approval pause, trapping natural gas in the US, keeping home heating costs low, keeping manufacturing inputs low, and screwing over our allies. Like this is a raw domestic play. You could bemoan it, it could frustrate you, you could think it's terrible policy. All those things we believe are true, but that's the reality on the ground. As my friend Tony Greer likes to say, he runs TG Macro, good friend of ours, and fellow newsletter writer. He's more of a trader than we are. He says you got to trade the pieces on the board, like you're talking about earlier. Oh, the data's made up, or the government's fudging CPI. The market's going to react to the print. Trade the print, and I think that's just the way you got to go about it.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember seeing a piece. I don't know if you ever heard of Edward Kirshner, but he was the chief investment strategist at Payne Weber back in the late 90s, and he was really good with trends. But most importantly, he was a great speaker. So I got to see him speak once, and he did this piece on CPI, and he showed basically 10 years of the CPI. So it was like, here's the print, and then here's 20 different revisions afterwards, and it was all over the place. And he's like, so numbers don't really matter because it could be up 3%, down 3%. You can revise it here, revise it there. At the end of the day, it's the first number, and nobody cares after that. And it could be way different, but it's just, yeah, like you said, I think it's a smart perspective. I did want to ask, because you mentioned Europe. I mean, Germany obviously is actively shooting themselves in the foot, getting rid of nuclear in exchange for whatever their policy is now. I don't even know. But it does bring in the aspect of nuclear, which to me, I mean, can you? I don't know if you have an opinion on this. Like, why would Germany do that? They can't be that dumb. But like, why would they actively get rid of nuclear reactors, which are productive and not relying on Russia, and then basically put themselves at the mercy for Russia at this point?
Yeah, and that didn't really work out. We wrote a piece on this called Full Circle back in February, early part of February, and we opened it by saying Germany's national energy strategy is one of the great mysteries of our time. Honestly, don't know. I can't explain. Have no idea how it could be that a country so rich in engineering heritage and so many, I have so many friends in Germany who are brilliant, hardworking, caring, careful, upstanding people. They are the victims of an enormous propaganda campaign against nuclear power, which baffles me. In the decades ahead, we will find out who paid for that campaign. I have my thoughts. But it is truly one of the most illogical moves ever made by a ruling class in the history of Western economic development. This dismantling of 22 gigawatts of the world's best run nuclear reactors. These weren't just any nuclear reactors. These are like the best run nuclear reactors in the world. Safest, highest capacity factors, best maintained, day in, day out, churning out 170 terawatt hours per year of carbon-free baseload power, as we said in the piece, an enviable anchor that served as one of two economic foundations for its once impressive manufacturing sector. And that they did this to themselves it's just incomprehensible. Now, one significant benefit is the rest of the world gets to see the consequences of this. And I think they're saying to themselves, I don't want that. And to the extent that Germany is leading by negative example, I suppose that's small consolation to the victims of this policy, which are the everyday citizens of Germany, the working class people. But it is what it is. Truly amazing. Germany accounts for so little of the world's carbon emissions, first of all, that like anything they do is going to be washed away in the measurement error of what China does. And we all live on this shared globe. And so to attack baseload carbon-free power on this scale is truly baffling. There's no other way to say it. It's baffling.
And as a follow-up to that, though, I have to ask because nuclear has been baffling me for years as to, we have this big push for clean energy, and I know obviously there's stuff going on there, but there's this huge push, and nuclear is the clear winner. If that is your intention to have clean energy and to clean up the world and all the things that politicians want to do, nuclear is a clear winner. Maybe you can, if I'm incorrect, let me know. But and if it is, why is it not getting the airtime? Why is it not getting any sort of attention when it's a clear solution? And maybe they don't want to solve the problem. Maybe that's the answer. I don't know.
There you go. So let me do a little one-upper for you here. It is by far the most superior fuel we have available to us. It's far superior to fossil fuels, which themselves are far superior to intermittent renewables. And that we have not proliferated the civilian use of nuclear energy is one of the great scandals of the second half of the 20th century. And the history of it is quite ugly, actually, and needs to be said. There was a small core of Malthusian, anti-human progress, environmental types who were really born out of the eugenics movement, who looked overseas, predominantly to Asia and Africa, and decided that they were growing their populations too fast. And the world couldn't contain as many people as were coming. And so, per Malthus, decided that the last thing that should be in the hands of the great unwashed masses is access to cheap, abundant primary energy. And so the opposition to nuclear power from the founders of the Sierra Club and the Greenpeaces of the world was born out of an anti-human agenda. They wanted less people. Now, I think the vast majority of environmentalists who are opposed to nuclear today don't realize that history and aren't anti-human, at least consciously, they don't know that what they're proposing will actually result in the death of billions of people. But the original opposition to nuclear power, in which two main strategies were deployed, was born out of this Malthusian limits to growth school of the radical environmental movement. The two strategies they used to great effect, by the way, they should be given full credit. They have steamrolled the nuclear power industry in the propaganda war. First is they wildly exaggerated the risk of nuclear waste and reactor meltdown risk. You cannot find a single human being in the world today who has ever been injured by nuclear waste. Not one. I can find you people who have fallen off of wind turbines. People die in the oil and gas fields all the time. 250,000 people, it is hypothesized, died in a dam collapse in China in the 70s. Not a single human being alive on the planet or who has ever lived on this planet has been injured by nuclear waste in a civilian nuclear reactor. And the number of deaths and injuries associated with the high-profile accidents that we've had, namely Chernobyl and Fukushima, pale in comparison to like just the OSHA statistics of virtually every other industry. Now, we have been conditioned to believe that civilian nuclear reactors are tantamount to nuclear weapons, and that radiation is somehow artificially more toxic than traditional chemical pollution. The second thing that they have done quite successfully, so the propaganda campaign of instilling fear in the population has worked beyond probably even their wildest imagination. They have infected the regulatory bodies of the Western world in order to make it all but impossible to build and maintain nuclear reactors, to the point where investment money has stayed clear of the sector. They do this by demanding impossible safety standards that, on a cost-benefit analysis, provide very little in the way of benefit, but an enormous amount of cost. Zero is an emotional number, of course, and they play to that. Lawsuits, frivolous lawsuits. But the NRC, for example, in the US is the single greatest impediment to the development of nuclear power. It is infected with Malthusian anti-human environmentalists who view it as their life mission to stop the proliferation of nuclear power. Nuclear is expensive and takes too long today, and these are political choices. It wasn't expensive and didn't take too long when France did it in the 70s, when Canada did it during the similar time period. You're trying to tell me that 50 years later, we can't do better than what France did? Of course we could. These are political choices. And they have won. They have steamrolled the nuclear industry. The ugly history, which they would like to rewrite, is one that we occasionally remind people of. You can go back and read it. It doesn't age well. Let's put it that way. A lot of racial undertones, a lot of things that the Sierra Club would love to put down the memory hole, for example. But it is what it is. Here's where we are now. I think those people are dying off, literally dying off. And I think the next generation of concerned environmentalists who have a genuine belief that emitting CO2 into the atmosphere is a challenge for humanity and we should do less of it, are coming around to the fact that it will be impossible for us to decarbonize without a massive nuclear renaissance. I happen to think neither will happen. I don't think we'll decarbonize, and I don't think we'll go down the nuclear road as much as we need to in order to decarbonize. I think we're just going to roll the dice, as I articulated earlier. But logically, there is no path to decarbonization that does not involve nuclear.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, India and China are building a huge number of nuclear plants right now, aren't they?
They're doing an all of the above strategy. So it's not a displacement strategy. And this is another view of ours. Like, all primary energy is additive. Nobody's going to voluntarily not use primary energy because energy is life. Energy is standard of living. Right angles do not appear spontaneously in nature. The human endeavor is a constant, unrelenting struggle against the forces of entropy. And in order to impose order on your local environment, which is a literal definition of your standard of living, you have to waste heat. You have to waste heat. Thermodynamics demands it. The amount of heat you get to waste defines your standard of living. We all enjoy an amazing standard of living here in the West. We flick a switch and lights come on. We get into a car and press a button, and then we go where we want to go. We go to the grocery store, and derivatives of energy are there on offer for incredibly cheap prices. We take all this for granted because we have won. And we have won the energy war in the West temporarily. We are risking losing it, of course. But the further you get from the oil field, from the nuclear reactor control room, the easier it is to take for granted the dizzying array of work that these brilliant people do every day that makes our society work. And we, for one, want to acknowledge that, to highlight it, and to remind people of that, because I think it's important that this is the foundation of our political discourse. How much energy we're going to make this year, and how are we going to divide it equitably? Those are the only two real questions politics needs to answer.
What do you think, given all we talked about, I mean, what do you think the biggest surprises are for the next year or two in the energy space?
I think the ongoing glut of natural gas is a real challenge for the industry to work through. And whether that persists or whether producers, especially in the US, manage to curtail production in time remains to be seen. I think that's one. I think, we all talk about 2030 net zero goals. Eventually, we're going to start pushing all those out because we're all just going to miss them all. Like it's just, So we made a call that we experienced peak ESG in COP28. So a surprise might be just how quickly countries turn away from their climate goals. Keep an eye on the German political situation. And then finally, one more prediction for you. I think the energy crisis of Europe could lead to a redrawing of political maps. It's not clear to me that Germany remains one country. It's not clear to me that the European Union can persist. It looks like Russia is going to potentially experience substantial battlefield success in Ukraine in the coming weeks and months. That might surprise people and might lead to a real crisis and panic in the NATO alliance. Ultimately, energy is the master resource. And if you get it wrong long enough, bad things happen.
So how do you think, I mean, you kind of mentioned redrawing the political lines in Europe. What do you think that looks like? I mean, you think Germany's going to split? I mean,
Well, if
what's
you
your
look at the AfD polling numbers in East Germany, so a party that the German establishment, which is mostly derived from West Germany, is threatened with being outlawed despite having 40 to 45% support in East Germany. Like, how's that going to work? Right? I mean, they're going to create the ultimate Streisand effect. And I think they radically underestimated Putin. They certainly screwed up the sanctions policy, which we have been, as we said in the piece this morning, of the things we're least happy to be most right about. Our early call that this sanction strategy not only would not work, but would backfire is one of the best calls we've made since starting Doomberg. We stand by it. Our leaders have learned nothing. We keep doubling and tripling down, playing into Putin's hands, and then wonder why it is that he's winning. He's winning. Putin is winning. Like, let's just say this: Putin is winning. NATO is losing. Putin is winning on the global stage, and he's winning on the battlefield. And we are an ever-shrinking alliance in the West that is in denial. Putin's winning, and I believe me, this is not the outcome that we would have wanted. It's just the outcome that's there.
Yeah, it's funny. Somebody made a comment the other day, and I had to stop to think about it. They said that that Trump is the only president in the last, I don't forget, it was 20 years or whatever, that hasn't started a war when he was president.
Oh, look, I mean, the elite radically underestimate Trump's popularity. I live in flyover country. Look, I was educated in the cities, and I mostly worked in the cities. I understand the sort of the coastal elite mindset, but I live in flyover country. Bubba's mad, right? Like, and Bubba's got a lot of guns. Right. And so, like, again, back to playing the pieces on the board, like my friend Tony says, like, I can tell you, Bubba's mad. I was interested to see the polling numbers in Michigan. Trump beat Haley, by 42 points. He's going to sweep Super Tuesday. And yet, how many felony charges is he facing by mostly Democratic attorney generals? Where are we going here? One of the scariest things about the U.S. is that neither side will accept the next result. Of that, I'm sure. Yeah. No side will accept the next result, and that is very dangerous. I can observe Trump, and believe me, I know his flaws. My wife reminds me of them all the time. But he's going to win the Republican nomination handily, and he's going to be formidable as an opponent. And efforts to take him off the ballots or to indict him are only feeding his power base. And I can tell you one thing, that if the coastal elites certainly don't understand energy, but I can tell you they understand Bubba even less.
Yeah. Yeah, that's for sure. That's for sure. Yeah, living in the East Coast, I can definitely agree with that. I did want to ask one question that I don't know if this comes up often, but the U.S. electrical grid is kind of a mess, and obviously we're trying to electrolyze our vehicles and everything else now, and in greater energy demands. I don't know. Do you have an opinion on what that looks like in the near future? Because it doesn't seem like there's any attention is being paid to it.
Yeah, this is something we've written about a fair bit. Our friend Robert Bryce has a wonderful documentary out called Juice, which I recommend everybody go and find. Just Google Robert Bryce Juice. Um, very, very good documentary on the topic. I think people are waking up to it. I think grid operators are sounding the alarm. I think we'll pull back from the abyss in time. That's my base case. And I think we have reached peak EV as well. We're seeing that ultimately the early adopter crowd, sort of, we jokingly call them virtue signalers, people who are willing to have a third car be an EV and put a few solar panels on the roof to impress the neighbors, actually don't really want to make any meaningful sacrifices to their standard of living and won't. The soft left, as we call them.
Did I mention I live in Massachusetts?
Yeah. Look, I mean, your gas policy in Massachusetts is insane. And so ultimately something's got to give, right? I mean, and it will give. Like, I do think one of our overarching philosophies is means or regress to. And the harder you pull on the elastic band, the quicker the snapback. And we're seeing that now with the rejection of electric vehicles and the pivot towards plug-in hybrids, which is a full vindication of Toyota's strategy, by the way. And it's no surprise that their stock has done so well in the past couple of years. People know what they want. People know what they're willing to sacrifice, and it ain't much. We like to joke, you first. And what's kind of a funny thing to say, because it really boils it down to its essence. Like, if you believe that we should all be living in huts and eating bugs, go ahead, lead by example. Tell us how it goes. We're not going to do that. And the vast majority of people, the vast middle, the soft left, soft right, which I think accounts for 80% of the electorate, is not willing to sacrifice a single thing about their lives. And they won't. And so again, back to the pieces on the board. The harder you push, like all of these banning of internal combustion engines, it's all going to get pushed back. That's not going to happen. I think I saw a headline in Europe where they're going to ban repairing internal combustion engine cars that are more than 15 years old. I mean, okay, make everybody poor and then force them to buy new cars. Got it. Let's see how you do at the polling box. Which is why, of course, they have to redefine the word democracy to mean anybody who doesn't disagree with us. We have to protect democracy. So that's coming.
So what do you think? We have the election coming up. I've got my thoughts, but I'm curious on how you think policy is going to change based on the two candidates, which eventually be, Biden or Trump. So what do you think will change given, if anything, given the results?
It's not clear to me that Biden will be on the ticket. I think even the betting markets are indicating a much higher likelihood that it won't be him than for any other incumbent, at this point in the election cycle. I'm not sure that the policy intents of the winner are going to matter as much as the response from the losing side. And that's kind of a political singularity through which it's very difficult to read. I'm very concerned about the election, in all transparency. I frankly really don't care who wins, but I would like to see one side win decisively enough that the other side accepts it. And I just don't think that's going to happen. And that's very, very dangerous. And I do think, we're at the peak of the fourth turning, and we try to stay optimistic because after the fourth turning comes the rebirth, but the friction of that transition can be very difficult. And I'm afraid that the apex of friction might be upon us this November, because even if it is Biden and Trump, who's going to accept the outcome?
Yeah. Well, I can concur with that. If it's close, it's
even if it's not close. But both sides are going to say it was, we have lost something essential in our social cohesion, and that concerns me greatly.
Yeah, well, I can agree with that. Well, I really appreciate you coming to the show, Doomberg. Any kind of final thoughts for our listeners that you think they should think about in terms of the energy sector moving forward?
Yeah, no, just final reminder that you should observe reality and try to analyze it as opposed to advocate for a position. And once you do that, I think the world can make a lot more sense to you. It's been a great discussion. Always, happy to have such in-depth discussions with people like you and really enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us. And where can people find more about you? I know you have a great publication on Substack. And where can people find more about you?
Yeah, that's all of our work is at doomberg.substack.com. You'll find our articles. You'll find access to our pro tier, which is a higher end version of our subscription offering. All the podcast appearances that we do are listed in a separate tab called Doomcast, and so this one will be up there, for example, when it publishes. But that's where we are. That's the work of our lives. This is what we were meant to do, and our objective is to just keep doing it. And so, doomberg.substack.com, and Kurt, it was great.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us, Doomberg, and I highly recommend listeners go there and subscribe. His research is priceless, and if you're really looking for objective viewpoint in the energy sector, this is it. So thank you again for joining us.
You bet.
Hey, Doug, did you hear? We're giving away free money. Well, I'll tell you about it in a minute, but before I do, there's a saying in the mining community, well, precious metals mining, that is. The saying is that if you want the best deals, you have to be in the room. Now, you're probably thinking, what does it mean to be in the room? Well, I'll tell you. Being in the room means that you're on the short list of people who get invited to be a part of the best deals. These are the deals that most investors will never have access to. You mean like IPOs? Nope, IPOs are chump change. Those are for retail investors, small potatoes. That's nothing compared to these deals. These deals would have you salivating to get access to them. Once you know they exist, you will never look at investing the same way again. I almost don't want to even tell you that they exist because it will ruin your thinking of how the investing world really works. Now, you might be excited that these deals exist, but you only have access to the deals if you're an insider, or in the room as they call it. Now, as loyal listeners to the show, I'm going to give you a chance to be in the room. Money Tree Investing Podcast has created the Insiders Club. This is a community of our show's members who are loyal listeners of the show and want to get more out of their investing experience. Being a part of the Insiders Club gives you insider status for upcoming events and webinars, discounts, free stuff and books, and influence on the future direction of the show. This is a great opportunity to join us as we expand our content and services. Oh, and did I mention free money? Yes, in the next few weeks, I'll be giving away free money to our members of the Insiders Club as my appreciation for listening to the show. Now, there's no cost to join the Insiders Club. Just go to moneytreepodcast.com/free money today to join the community. That's www.moneytreepodcast.com/free money. I hope to see you in the room.
All right. Well, that was a great interview with Doomberg. Really appreciate him coming on the show. Always love getting experts in to talk about some of these areas like energy, which it's funny. We bring in people occasionally to talk about energy, but there's so much there. It's such a complex topic that, it's always good to get somebody who's really knows their stuff because it usually pokes hole in some of the narratives that we hear in the media and the financial realm. So now we're into the panel portion of the show. We have our very own Megan Gorman. Hey, Megan.
Hi, Kirk. How you doing?
Good. We also have our very own Phil Weiss. Hey, Phil.
Hey, Kirk. Good to be here today.
Awesome. Well, we're gonna mix it up a little bit today. We're gonna have Megan interview Phil and I.
Yes, I'm gonna drill you guys. I'm gonna drill you guys on energy.
Gonna drill us like a well.
No.
All right.
Okay. Well, so I think let's start just really, I would love to hear both of your takeaways from this interview. So Kirk, because you are always the one asking us that question, I'm going to start with you.
I have to say, I really love the interview. I've been trying to get Doomberg on the show for a while. Him and his team, they're just so smart. And what I find interesting is in the energy space, there's so many narratives, right? Like everyone's got a narrative. Like you've got a political narrative, you got a media narrative, you got the Wall Street narrative. You got all these narratives floating around, and the energy market's one of those things. I would never trade it because you really have to have your politics in order because it's so complicated. Mm-hmm. And I never touched oil because it's a political commodity. So I just stayed away from it because I know that, hey, it looks like this should happen and it doesn't happen. I'm like, why the heck isn't that happening? I can never understand it. And sometimes we have our own white whale in our lives that you just got to stay away from. You're just like, you know what? I'm not going to chase a white whale. I'm just going to go the other way and go do something else. And I think with oil, that's always been my thing. Is like, I don't understand it. I'm staying away from it. But when we have somebody on like Doomberg who can really like take the marrow out of the topic and really distill it simply, I just love. So yeah, I love the interview, and I always learn a lot when I listen to people like him or some of the others we brought on that talk about it, because you're like, oh really, that's interesting, I hadn't thought of it that way. So that I love this stuff. So that's what I got to say, Megan.
Excellent. How about you, Phil? I know you have a lot more focus on this in your daily practice, or maybe
Well,
you're
not
just more
necessarily-
interested in it.
Not necessarily in my daily practice, but for 7 years, I was an analyst and I covered oil and gas stocks. So I have a lot of
This is your
background.
wheelhouse.
Sure. And, and one of the things that I always think about with the energy industry is it's not really easy to invest in. It's very unpredictable.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was an analyst, I used to get calls from media, TV, all this kind of stuff. And they'd say, so Phil, what do you think the price of oil is going to be? And I always used to answer it this way. I said, part of my job, I'm paid to predict what the price of oil is going to be. So I'm going to give you a number. But after I give you that number, I'll also tell you this. There's about one number I can assure you that it's not going to be. And that's the number that I'm going to give you now. And the reason is because it is political, right? The normal laws of supply and demand don't apply to oil, because you have countries, their whole economy in the middle, especially in the Middle East, it's dependent upon oil. So we have other factors that influence how oil is priced beyond just supply and demand. And then it's always interesting to talk about when people would find out I'm an energy analyst. They would always ask me a lot of questions. Why? Because it's one of those things that it's put in our face every day. You go to the gas station, you put gas in your car, and you know what the price of gas is, and you see it go up and down all the time. And everybody wants to blame the oil companies for it,
Right.
but they don't really set that price. The price is set on a commodities exchange where there's lots of other factors. So it's not Exxon that's setting the price. And I'll also tell you this, if you go into an Exxon station, Exxon probably doesn't own it. 99% of the time, at least they don't. Somebody's licensed their name and put it on that station, but they don't own the station. So blaming them isn't it. And oil companies, do they make money? Yes, but they're also so heavily taxed. Their margins are much lower than other conventional industries. So I know not all those things were covered during the interview, but those are all things to me that make oil and gas such an interesting topic to talk about.
Yeah, I
Because
mean,
it's topical for everybody.
right. And I think the thing is, right, we show our clients a chart where in 2022, energy was the best performing asset class. 2023, it's the worst performing. With where we're sitting today in 2024, with, you know, a focus on renewables, innovation and clean energy, global demand being very heightened. If you're sitting out there saying, should I make sure I have energy in my portfolio? Is this an interesting time to be investing in energy? And I'm going to start with Phil with that one.
It might be, but the thing that makes it really hard is the other thing I'll say, if you go back, look, I think about 2008, or we could even go back to 22 when oil prices went negative because of how the futures market worked. But in 2008 and 2009, when we had the global crisis in the markets, oil prices peaked at almost $150. And within weeks, oil was $33. It moves so much. Oil is different too, because when I covered it, I always wanted to look at what the costs were, the companies, and not necessarily some of the other aspects, because costs matter, because they could control their costs a lot of the time, but they couldn't control what price they were getting. Like there's in economic terms, there's price takers and price makers. In the oil industry, you're much more of a price taker. You take what the market gives you. And if you go down the chain, the refineries are at the lowest level, right? Because they have to buy the oil and they sell what the market gives them. They're the weakest of the price takers, right? They're in the worst position in the whole value chain. At least if you're producing the oil, you're higher up the line. Oil companies are nice to own from one perspective. They usually return a good amount of capital and cash to shareholders. A lot of them have good yields.
Mhm.
It's a lot of volatility. I will tell you that I'm not a big allocator to the sector. I
Interesting.
think that there's a lot of reasons not to be. Some people argue, and justifiably so, that oil's not going anywhere anytime soon because it takes so long to turn over an auto fleet. We can't just suddenly become all electric cars or all hybrids or whatever it is, because it takes 15 to 20 years to do that. So it's still
Right.
going to be around for a while.
Right.
It's not like we have so much excess so that we can stop producing it. But if you look at the global picture, like if the climate change and everything else,
Mhm.
it seems like we're going to move away from it over time, but it is a nice place to go for income, for sure, right? These companies pay good dividends. I like clean energy, but it's hard to invest in a lot of that too, because just like look at the solar companies. Like if you look at companies like Enphase and SolarEdge, their stocks have gotten pummeled.
Yeah.
Enphase came back some, but it's a very volatile sector. If you're looking at it for income, that's generally when I'm putting people into energy stocks. It's because I like the income that comes with it, and I feel like the price that I'm getting at it is okay. I'm not necessarily as tied into the appreciation at that point as I am to the income that it can generate.
Excellent. Before I get to Kirk, I just want to ask you a follow-up. So I think it's interesting what you're saying about how you are using energy stocks or not using energy stocks in a portfolio. So do you see an allocation to energy as more strategic, more tactical, a hedge? How do you describe it to people that you're managing their portfolios?
So I generally don't think of myself as doing a lot tactical.
Mm-hmm.
Usually the people that have an energy allocation are people that are looking for income from their portfolio. And I'm looking for investments for them that can help give them the yield that they're looking for so that they can get that income.
Okay.
So if you want to call that strategic or tactical, you can, but it's just around where they are. If it's not, I'm never going to leave it out because I believe in asset allocation. So I'm not going to leave out a sector totally.
Mm-hmm.
Now I do have some clients that go to the ESG side. And if they go to the ESG side, I will leave out the traditional oil and gas companies, a lot of utilities. I will also
Mm-hmm.
tell you that if you're looking for ESG ETFs,
Mm-hmm.
it's not so easy because they say they're ESG, but then they own Exxon, right? Because they have other criteria. It's crazy. There's just
Right.
not good standards for ESG investing.
Right.
So just because you see a fund that says it's a ESG fund and it owns energy, that doesn't mean that it's really clean energy. So if that's what you want, you have to be careful. So like I can think of one client in particular, I've built a very customized portfolio for her
Mm-hmm.
because that was what would give her the least amount of exposure to traditional hydrocarbons that I could.
Oh, that's really helpful. That's incredibly helpful to take something we just heard and think about in context of the portfolio. So you brought up the concept of ESG. Kirk, I'm going to turn this to you. Let's talk about ESG. First of all, what is it? And then what impact is it having on energy and holding energy stocks? And how should people think about that in their portfolios?
Yeah, and Megan, in context to your last question to Phil, is this an interesting time in energy? It really is in so many different ways.
Yeah.
I'll get to ESG in a minute. I want to address the other question because where we are now, um, if you think of these inflection points in history, right? There are certain periods of time where a new technology or some discovery changes the landscape of everything, right? Like nuclear, when that came out, it changed the landscape in so many different ways, right?
Mhm.
From having this mutually assured destruction between countries, between having nuclear power to generate clean energy, all these different things that changed because of the discovery of nuclear energy. Um, Same thing happened with oil, discovery of oil, and using that to basically power our lives. And I think the way people need to think about it is um, cheap energy, and I'll get to the cleanliness in a minute. Cheap energy is what drives our future growth as a species, as a country, as whatever you want to think about it. Like cheap energy, the more cheap energy you have, the more productivity and advancements you can have. If you think about it, if you have enough energy to power the electricity in your house, that's great. But if you can power like, a whole city, well, now you've got progress, right? Now you can expand, you can grow, you can make more things electrified, right? You just think if we had free electric energy, what would we do? Well, we'd probably have everyone have an electric car because it'd be free, right? If you think about, so instead of paying for oil, we would have everyone have electric cars. Now, it's not practical in the today's sense, but there's, we get stuck in this Malthusian kind of cognitive bias. We all think like, oh, we're going to run out of oil, we're going to run out of this, we're going to run out of that. And the reality is that technology saves us every single time. Because if we thought we're going to run out of oil and we said, well, oil is going to be $500 a barrel, well, we're not going to be able to drive, no one's going to be able to afford that, and the price goes up enough, so then people say, well, actually I came up with this cool technology and now it's affordable because you have $100 barrel oil. You can afford, like fracking. Fracking was created because we had high energy prices. It was not created, but it incentivized that to happen. And all of a sudden now it's really low because you came up with this new technology. So the Malthusian perspective of everything's going to get expensive and it's going to get indefinitely expensive is just not true, because technology always saves the day because it incentivizes people to come up with things to save on costs, right, and to lower prices. Now, if you think of like the ESG movement, getting back to your question, the ESG movement was incentivized by people who want a cleaner planet. And I think everyone on this planet wants a cleaner planet. And I think it's become politicized, unfortunately. It's basically one group uses power over another group. But the reality is we all want a cleaner planet. The practicality of it is what's in question. So can we all live on windmills and solar power? No, we can't, because that is not load power. So what happens when the wind stops blowing or it's nighttime? Well, obviously, we don't have any energy. So that's a problem, right? So the pragmatic nature of energy is complex, because you could say, well, yeah, we just have more solar power. And yeah, if you want to blanket the desert in solar panels, more power to you. But the problem is what happens when it's nighttime. The battery technology is not at the level where we can take all that energy and store it and use it later, right? So you've got this disconnect. We can create energy, right? Or we can harness it, would be a better way to say it. But then you have no way to store it. So if we had a great way to efficiently store energy, then great, wind power, solar power, have as much as you want. It's still not as efficient, but I get it, right? I could understand that. But the problem is we have this disconnect where people see, oh, it's clean energy. Okay, great. There's a lot of clean energy out there. And if you think about the cheap energy, right, which is important for progress and for technology and for, our growth as a species, natural gas is really cheap right now. Nuclear is one of the best, cheapest energies out there. And yet we almost have no desire to pursue it. The clean energy movement, the people who are in favor of clean energy, who are trying to, global warming and that whole thing, like no one is talking about nuclear. So one of the main reasons why I don't believe a lot of the political movements around the clean energy movement is because it's not practical. They're looking at it as power over one group over another. And that's what it is. At its core, ESG is the same thing. At its core, it is one group trying to get power over another. Because if you truly thought that, hey, we need to get rid of carbon energy, we need to get rid of dirty energy, and like I said, I don't think anyone on the planet is for dirty energy. But we need a substitute. Well, the problem is no one on either side is for nuclear. Nuclear is the clear winner in this game. If you want clean energy, if you want cheap energy, nuclear is the clear winner. But no one, well, I should say no one, virtually no one is talking about it, and virtually no one of power, meaning politicians, are even considering it. So if you truly wanted to solve the problem, we do have solutions. And the fact that no one's talking about them leads me to believe that no one really wants to solve the problem. So ESG is another side effect of this movement of, hey, we want a cleaner planet and we want to, tell people what to do. And this is what I say, it's power. And, take the pun what it is, but it's basically one, group having power over another. It's like, we should tell the companies what to do. They have this dirty energy. It's like, okay, well, why don't you actually try to solve the problem, right? ESG is an interesting idea, but it also, as Phil said, when you have ExxonMobil ranked high in ESG, like, is it really solving the problem? So there's been this under the surface discussion since it started on Wall Street, and the consumers don't always hear this, that ESG is basically what they would deem as greenwashing. And what that's basically referred to is just, it's another shiny object that Wall Street uses to sell to the public because the public is demanding it, but it's not actually solving any problems.
So Kirk, I got to ask, do you have clients that ask you to run ESG portfolios?
No, no, they
okay.
don't. And I have had people ask, like, some prospects, and I'll just tell them flat out. I say, look, there's two ways to look at it. Do you want to make money, or do you want to feel good about yourself? Because those don't necessarily align. And in good times, you can go all ESG you want, but when we have recessions, what works well in recessions? Energy, gambling, alcohol, tobacco. You're not saving the planet with any one of those, but in a recession, those tend to do well. So people, what they don't understand is there's a first degree of effect, and then there's like the unintended consequences. Like, yeah, sure, if you want to feel good about your portfolio, that's great. If you want to make money, you have to figure out what your priorities are. I'm not going to say you shouldn't feel good about yourself. Do it. It's your money. Do whatever you want. But for me, and I'm responsible for a lot of clients, my job is not to feel good about myself. My job is to help them make money and to educate them on why certain decisions are better than others. And if they say, hey, I don't want to invest in oil companies, I'm okay with that. That's their choice, right? And I do have some clients who are like, I don't want to invest in oil, or I don't want to invest in smoking or whatever. I'm cool with that. I like I said, it's not my money, but if my job is to help people make money, my job is to see through the Wall Street BS, which is the point, part of the point of the show is to help educate the public on what's BS and what isn't. And I'm not saying the purpose of ESG is BS. I'm not saying climate change is BS, although I have my opinions. My point is just to point out, like, here's the reality of what we see, and here's what the public is hearing. And those frequently don't align. Wall Street doesn't always align with reality. It's more aligning with Wall Street's job is to sell you something. Just being frank, Wall Street's job is to sell you something. And if you're clamoring for something, they're going to create it. And here's a point, and then I'll hand the mic back. There was a coal ETF that it was KOL, I think was the symbol. And it was basically investing in coal companies, right? And good or bad. At the height of the ESG and the global warming and all this movement, they actually closed the ETF because there was not enough interest in it. And oddly enough, that was the very bottom of coal prices and the coal producer prices. That was the very bottom of the pricing. And it went up from there. As soon as they got rid of the ETF, prices went up. The consumers are always wrong as a collective. Which is, it's interesting as an investor, because you see, like, you look at extremes. That was an extreme, and I should have seen it, and I should have invested in a bunch of coal companies. I didn't, but that was a moment, right? And you see this often on Wall Street. So if you look at where the money's flowing, it's not necessarily the right thing, but it should be something you pay attention to, say, isn't that interesting? Like, they just closed a coal ETF. Maybe I should see what's going on here. And so I think that's kind of my takeaways with ESG. I think, you have to decide whether you want to, whether you want to pursue this or not.
Okay, so in hearing both of you, this is a very, very complex market to invest in. There are a lot of views, a lot of opinions. So is the energy market rational, right? Like, as an investor, if you approach it, should you expect it to be rational? And I'm going to ask that to Phil.
I would probably say no. It's not always rational because of the fact that I said it. The normal laws of supply and demand don't apply. right? Because you've got governments and their economies are running on it. You also have, Kirk was talking about Wall Street. I remember when I started covering the sector, there was a conversation about peak oil. We don't hear that anymore. And why don't we hear about peak oil anymore? Because of fracking. Because fracking gave them ways to access oil that they couldn't access before, to access natural gas. Like the amount of oil and natural gas that's been extracted from all these shale fields in places like the Marcellus and Haynesville and the Bakken and all these other places, we couldn't access that before. A whole new way of drilling came about. And they, in their annual reports, company after report, the size of the reserves, they say this is how much they have. Seems like they don't go down. And it's not like it's always because of new finding, it's because of new ways to access. So the data that we get isn't always good. The accounting methods, one of the companies that I covered, their accounting method let them amalgamate everything all together. So they say, oh, we have really cheap prices. Well, they were buying and selling properties, and that followed into their pricing that they were calculating. So the pricing meant nothing. So there's just, and you've got all this volatility, right? Oil prices can spike. They can go high and they can go low. And that does have a big impact. So it's a very hard industry to be a long-term player. I mean, even if you look at Buffett, he's invested in oil sometimes over the years. Right now, he's got a big investment in Occidental that has been built up, but he's had a lot of unsuccessful investments. Occidental's worked pretty well. And I will tell you that when I covered it, I can understand why Buffett bought Occidental, because there's a different CEO at the time than the one now. But when I listened to him, he thought and talked like Buffett does in terms of how he looked at the industry. And that's kind of how Occidental does things. So it's different. But most companies, there's two types of costs that we can have from an accounting perspective. We can have variable costs, are the ones that kind of fluctuate based upon our production or our units. And then we have fixed costs, which is just what you spend. And that's like almost like a sunk cost, right? Well, a lot of companies that are producing oil, they base all their decisions on the variable costs. The fixed cost is done, it's sunk, we don't care anymore. It's just the variable costs. Like they've lost money overall, but they're still producing because they need the cash flow that comes with producing at this variable cost. So even though it's not a profitable project, they'll continue. So there's a lot of irrationality that happens in the industry. I will tell you that since I stopped covering it, it has gotten a little bit better. Companies have been more focused on lowering their capex to more reasonable numbers, returning more cash to shareholders. That helps make it a little bit more investable, but it's still not easy to invest in. There are the exceptions, but as a rule, it's not a great place. I mean, even if you look at Exxon, there's times it's been a really good investment, but if you look at over the last couple of decades, it hasn't been a great investment. And that's the one everybody knows, but there's just a lot of irrationality. So I don't think of it as a very rational, easy place to invest.
Yeah. So Kirk, really quickly, what do you think? Is the energy market rational?
I think, if you look at it from its core, right? If you look at free market, a free market is rational because you have a collective amount of voices and voters by their wallets. That is rational. As rational as you can get. Now, is it always rational? Absolutely not. No markets are ever 100% rational, but it's the closest thing you can get to rational. Now, the reality is there's so much politics involved in the energy market that it's not rational. And it might be rational from one person's perspective, but not from the market's perspective. That is the point of the free market. So you might say, well, of course it's rational because I believe in A, B, C, and D. But I can also guarantee you're going to have someone else on the other side that says, no, you're wrong. I believe in X, Y, Z. And how do you know you're the correct one? Like none of us have a good grasp on reality. So, we could see the most recent, 8 years in politics. You have two separate political parties looking at the same set of facts and coming to completely different conclusions. You can look at the same video and you could hear somebody say the same exact words, and one person will say, no, he said this, and the other person says, no, he said that. We're not rational. Human beings are not rational. Like we don't have a good grasp of reality. So if you think about the fewer people you have, and the energy market is effectively an oligopoly, you got a few players who are controlling the price, and it's governments, it's companies, but we're all subject to that. So if Saudi Arabia decides, you know what, we're going to flood the market because we don't like you guys, and so we're going to flood the market and drive the price down, that affects everybody, right? If we decide to do that to Russia, and we tried and failed, if we decide to do that, is that rational? No, it's not rational. It's not based on supply and demand, right? As Phil said earlier, prices should be based on supply and demand. So if it's not based on supply and demand, then it's not rational. And that's the reality. Any sort of good that is supply and demand based is a rational price by the collective. When you have a handful of people dictating what the price is, it's not realistic, but it's the way it works. So I think the goal of clean energy, if you really take somebody who's really adamantly for that, and everyone wants it, but some people are just degrees of that. Take somebody who's really adamant about it. They look at it and they look at all the data and they say, this is the correct approach. And they say, all right, here's how we're going to do it. Now, unfortunately, our politics doesn't run that way and our country doesn't run that way.
Mm-hmm.
But if it was, then yes, that would be a rational approach. You could say, here are the 10 different kinds of energy we can produce. Here are ones are renewable. Here are ones are cheap. Here are ones are clean. You look at them all and say, all right, which is the best? And I've done this, and multiple people have done this. Nuclear is a clear energy winner. Now, you could say geothermal is a little better, and I would argue it might be. However, there are only a handful of places on the planet where it's actually economic, and it has to be a thin crust. You can get to the the lower parts of the crust, so it gets hotter. Like, you have to drill pretty deep, and if the crust is thin, it's easier. Like, look in Japan and some of the tectonic plates where they're converging. Like, Japan's one of them, and there's certain parts in the world where it's actually really economic. Iceland's another one. You can get a lot of bang for your buck up there. But in a place like Boston, you can't, so it's not economic. But if you look at all these different forms and say, all right, here are the cheapest, here are the cleanest, here are the most economical, and you look at all that and you make your decisions based on that, that's rational. If you make your decision based on, well, somebody told me solar is great and we should do more solar, and you've done no research, that's not rational. That's just somebody brainwashed you to think that that's a good method. I'm not saying it's bad. It's just you're looking at the most economical. It's not. And it takes up space and it's all over the place and it's dirty. Like, it's just, you got solar panels all over the place. Like, it's just not the best. And you got wind, which is okay, but you got wind farms in the middle of everywhere. It's just, no one wants them. It's a nuisance. Like, everything's got its cost, if you will, right? Like, nuclear has a quote unquote cost. And the cost for nuclear is, people don't like it because they don't want it in their backyard, as you said, NIMBY. It's just, they have this perception that it's bad. Okay, like, I don't want to live next to a nuclear plant either, but not because I'm afraid, but because the fact that my house price will probably decline. I mean, that would be my issue, but it has nothing to do with like the safety of it. So everything has a cost. We just have to determine what's the most important cost in the bucket.
Okay, well, as we wrap it up here, give me your final thoughts on, on energy. And I'm going to start with Phil.
Like I said before, energy is volatile. It used to be a bigger portion of the S&P than it is today because technology has become dominant in the industry, but technology is important to energy too. Like, I remember when I started covering this sector, I'm like, you want me to cover energy? That's boring. It's not at all. It's really a fascinating sector, and technology does play a big role. If you want to invest in energy, you're probably better off, as usual, as is normally the case, to invest in a sector ETF as opposed to trying to pick individual stocks. But if you wanted to go to that level, look at costs, because the costs matter. Look for the companies that are low cost producers. That's the best ones, and think of it as a way to get income. As for me, I know that experiencing big life transitions can be stressful, and my job is to help empower women facing new beginnings with the financial knowledge and tools they need to make self-assured decisions. My firm's Apprise Wealth Management. You can download my free ebook, How to Flourish Through Life's Big Changes, at apprisewealth.com/ebook. And you can also sign up for my blog. Thanks for having me today.
Thanks, Phil. How about you, Kirk?
All right, final thoughts from me. If you're interested in energy, talk to Phil. The thing about energy, and like any sector, is if you're really going to specialize in it, then you should be an expert or become an expert in it. And the energy sector is hard. You should not ignore it. You shouldn't ignore any sector or really any part of the economy, because they all have their pros and cons, right? I don't smoke. I'll never smoke. I don't like smoking, but I think tobacco companies they can be are really attractive at certain prices with certain yields, and you can't ignore that. You might not want to do it, but you shouldn't ignore it. You should at least voluntarily say, okay, I'm philosophically against this, even though it's a really attractive thing. And I think energy fills that bucket too. When oil prices were negative $20 during COVID, it's really hard to ignore oil prices. Like, are they going to go lower? Probably not. So I think we all have to keep in mind that that energy is important. You know, people don't like it; it's dirty. But the reality is you can't have technology without energy. You just can't, because what's it going to run on? It's going to run on electricity. Where does electricity come from? Energy, some form of energy. And you know, the way I think of it is, if we truly want to save the world, then we have to get rid of the politics, and we have to look at things from a clean lens and say, you know what, we need to look at all our options, and we need to decide what it's worth. Because if we truly solve the cheap energy problem in a way that doesn't, you know, pollute the planet, then we're going to make paradigm shifts in our technological advancements in our society, in our culture, and the planet. And I think people that truly want to save the planet or change the planet, this is the path. And you can't pick and choose your arguments. You can't say you want a cleaner planet and then you just ignore nuclear, because what ends up happening is what happened in Germany and Europe, where they got rid of nuclear and then they went to coal. I mean, that's just stupid, right? And it's the unintended consequences of politics that tend to make things worse for people. So that's my final thoughts.
Thank you, Kirk.
All right. Well, thanks, Megan. Appreciate the interview questions today.
That's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us on Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name's Kirk Chisholm, wealth manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on this show. You can also check out our show at Money Tree Investing Podcast. On our website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Please remember to subscribe on our YouTube channel for immediate access to the new shows when they're released. When you subscribe to the show, it allows us to get access to some of the top minds of investing in personal finance. While you're here, please leave a comment and question if you want us to address it on the show. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do, so invest in your life.